Officer Mark Talbot had been patrolling the quiet town of Ash Hollow for nearly 8 years. It was a peaceful place, one of those sleepy, tree-lined towns where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest crimes were usually teenagers sneaking beer into the woods or the occasional neighborly dispute over a fence, but lately, things felt off. It began 2 weeks ago. Mark was finishing his night patrol near the edge of town, headlights barely brushing the thick woods bordering the old Reynolds farm, long abandoned. That's when he saw it. A dog. A large, black German shepherd with deep, piercing eyes and a coat that shimmered like ink under moonlight. It stood by the road, unmoving, almost statuesque, until Mark's cruiser slowed down. Then it followed. At first, Mark assumed it was just a stray. Maybe someone's lost pet. He didn't give it much thought. Dogs followed cars sometimes. But this one didn't stop. Every night since, no matter where his shift began or ended, the dog appeared. It didn't bark, didn't approach. Just followed, staying far enough to be out of reach but close enough that it was always in his rearview mirror. It wasn't wearing a collar. And when he tried to get near it, it vanished into the trees, like smoke. Tonight was no different, except for one thing. Mark had stopped for coffee at Jenny's diner around 2 a.m. As he stepped out with his thermos, he saw the dog again. This time, it was sitting beside his cruiser. Closer than ever before. Its eyes locked onto his. There was no aggression, just something else. Sadness? Desperation? Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Hey there, buddy," he said, cautiously stepping closer. "You lost." The dog didn't move. It simply lifted one paw slowly, as if reaching out. Mark's heart skipped. He crouched, flashlight in one hand, thermos in the other. Then he saw it. A number. Faintly tattooed into the skin beneath the fur of the raised paw. 21789. Mark stumbled back, flashlight clattering to the pavement. A cold sweat broke across his brow. That number, it wasn't random. He knew it. He had written it down once. Years ago. On the ID tag of a K-9 unit dog named Shadow. A dog that had died in the line of duty 5 years ago. A dog Mark had loved more than anything, but Shadow was gone. Buried. He had been there, holding the dog's lifeless body in his arms. So how was this happening? Mark sat back in the cruiser, his hands trembling around the steering wheel. The dog, no, Shadow was gone again. Just like every night. One moment there, the next, vanished into the dark, but this time wasn't like the others. He had seen the number. Tattooed exactly where the K-9 ID had been inked on Shadow during his days in the force. 21789. Mark hadn't just remembered it, he had it engraved on a plaque in his home in a small wooden frame beside Shadow's old collar. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered, rubbing his temples. He didn't go back on patrol that night. Instead, he drove to the old Reynolds farm. Something about the area had always unsettled him, too many calls over the years about strange noises, missing pets, even local kids claiming to see figures in the trees. He dismissed most of them, chalked it up to small-town hysteria. But now he wasn't so sure. He parked just off the dirt path leading into the woods. The place looked like something out of a forgotten storybook, gnarled trees, fallen fences, shadows moving even when the wind was still. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. Leaves crunched beneath his boots as he moved deeper into the trees. His breath was visible in the cold air, and silence hung around him like a heavy blanket. Then he heard it, a soft panting, just beyond the brush. "Shadow," he called out, voice barely above a whisper. A low growl answered him. Not hostile, more protective. Mark pushed forward. The beam of his flashlight flicked across trees, brush, and then there. A large figure, just ahead. The dog stood between two trees, head lowered, eyes watching. The same eyes. Unmistakable. Mark inched closer, hand out. "If it's really you, how are you here?" The dog turned and began walking slowly into the thicket, pausing every few feet to look back. Like it wanted Mark to follow, and he did. The trail wound through narrow paths that seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't say why. Then, just beyond a bend, he came upon a clearing he'd never noticed before. In the center, a collapsed wooden structure, possibly what remained of an old barn. Vines strangled the rotting beams and a foul odor hung in the air. That's when he saw the pit, roughly 6 feet wide, recently dug. And inside, bones. Dozens of them. Animal bones, human bones, he wasn't sure. But they were old. And yet, some looked disturbingly fresh. Mark stumbled backward. "What the hell is this?" Behind him, a low whimper. He turned. Shadow had stopped near a half-buried object at the edge of the pit. Mark brushed away dirt with shaking hands. A badge. Faded, cracked. His own department's insignia. And engraved in the corner, Detective Jared Cole. Mark froze. Jared had vanished 2 years ago during a forest search for a missing hiker. No trace ever found, until now. Mark couldn't look away from the badge in his hand. His old partner, Detective Jared Cole, had been more than just a colleague, he'd been a brother. They had gone through the academy together, shared drinks after late shifts, and cried over Shadow's burial like grieving parents. The official story was that Jared went missing while investigating a lead in the woods. After weeks of searching, his case was marked cold, filed away in a drawer like he had never existed. But here was his badge. In this pit, Mark's stomach twisted. Shadow let out a soft bark, startling him back to the moment. The dog circled the edge of the pit and stopped near a patch of disturbed earth beside a tree. Something else was buried there. Mark dropped to his knees and dug. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. A photograph. Water damaged, but still legible. It was of Jared standing beside two men in hunting gear. One of them was Sheriff Donovan Burke, the current sheriff. No, Mark whispered. Burke had always been a respected figure in Ash Hollow, stern, no nonsense, but fair. He had taken over after the previous sheriff's sudden retirement right around the time Jared went missing. Mark had never questioned it before. But now he stared at the photo. Burke, Jared, and another man, face obscured by damage, but something about him felt familiar. Mark felt like he was staring into the past at something meant to stay hidden. Then the dog barked again, sharply. Mark stood, heart pounding. Shadow stared toward the path, ears perked. Footsteps, someone was coming. Mark clicked off his flashlight and ducked behind a fallen log, gripping his service pistol tight. The footsteps grew louder, heavy, deliberate. A figure emerged, tall, dressed in a dark raincoat, flashlight sweeping the trees. Mark caught a glimpse of the man's face as the light passed. Sheriff Donovan Burke. He was alone. Or so he thought. Mark stayed low, watching as Burke walked straight to the pit, like he knew it was there. He didn't hesitate. He looked down at the bones, then at the half-dug hole near the tree. Cursed under his breath. So he knew. Burke reached into his coat and pulled something out. A flask? No, gasoline. Mark's eyes widened. Shadow let out a low growl. It echoed across the clearing like a warning from the grave. Burke spun around, flashlight raised. Who's there? Mark stood slowly, pistol drawn. Drop it, Burke. The sheriff's face paled, even in the dark. Talbot, what are you doing out here? I could ask you the same thing, Mark replied, stepping into view. You were going to burn it. Erase everything. Burke glanced at the dog. That damn mutt again. I thought he was dead. Mark's grip tightened on the pistol. He was. You made sure of it. The sheriff raised his hand slowly, but his expression was cold. Calculating. You don't understand, Mark. Jared, he knew things. He was going to ruin everything. I didn't have a choice. You always had a choice. Just then, Shadow stepped forward, growling louder. His eyes locked onto Burke's. And for a moment, just a moment, Mark swore he saw something ancient and angry in that gaze. Something more than a dog, something vengeful. The wind rustled the trees as Mark and Burke stared each other down in the eerie glow of moonlight. Between them stood Shadow, his growl low and steady, every muscle tense as if he were holding the night itself at bay. Burke took a cautious step back. This isn't what you think. Mark aimed his pistol squarely at him. Then why are you trying to burn a pit full of bones? Why did you lie about Jared? Burke's jaw twitched. Because Jared got too close to something dangerous. He was digging where he shouldn't have been. You mean this land? The Reynolds property? Burke nodded, eyes darting toward the pit. This place, it's not just old farmland. It was once used by a private military contractor back in the 80s. Off-the-books experiments, biotracking, psychological warfare. They were trying to create dogs that could do more than sniff out drugs, dogs that could feel emotions. Anticipate enemy movement. Shadow was part of that program. Mark's blood turned to ice. That's not possible. Shadow was a regular K-9. He passed all the tests. He was loyal. Brave. Burke shook his head slowly. He was more than that. Jared found the files. Shadow was one of the last of the K-9 units before the program was shut down. Most of the dogs were euthanized. But Shadow was adopted out, given a fresh identity and placed in a civilian precinct. Yours. Mark felt like the ground was tilting beneath him, but why kill Jared? He demanded. Burke's face darkened. Because he wanted to blow it all open. Go public. He found the clearing. The pit. The bodies of the others. He didn't understand the danger he was inviting. The others? Other handlers. Scientists. People who tried to bring the truth to light. They all ended up here. Burke gestured to the bones. You're a murderer, Mark said, his voice raw. I'm a protector, Burke shot back. Of this town. Of national security. Jared made the mistake of trusting something he couldn't control. He glanced toward Shadow again, suddenly more nervous. But that dog, he was supposed to be dead. We put a bullet in him after he bit one of the researchers. But he vanished. Now he's back. And if he remembers, Mark interrupted, cold and steady, he does. Shadow growled louder now, stepping forward. His gaze was locked on Burke, tail stiff, fur bristling. Mark could feel the tension in the air itself seemed charged with electricity. Burke panicked. Don't do this, Mark. But Mark had already made his choice. You're under arrest. For murder. For obstruction of justice. And for whatever the hell you've been trying to hide here. Burke made a sudden move for his coat, but Shadow lunged before Mark could react. Teeth sank into fabric and flesh. Burke screamed and went down, thrashing in the leaves. Mark rushed forward. Shadow! Back off! The dog obeyed instantly, stepping back and sitting with eerie calm. Burke clutched his shoulder, bleeding and groaning. Mark knelt beside him and snapped the cuffs onto his wrists. You're going to answer for everything. In the distance, the trees groaned as wind picked up. The past was clawing its way into the present. And the truth, ugly, twisted, and buried, was finally rising from the soil. Mark looked at Shadow, his old partner, his friend, and perhaps something even more. You saved me. Again. Shadow simply stared. Back at the station, the night had cracked into early morning. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy as the local deputies processed Burke. The room was silent, thick with shock. None of them had expected this. The sheriff they had worked with for years, now being booked for murder and conspiracy. Mark stood in the observation room, arms folded, watching Burke through the glass. Shadow sat quietly at his side. Mark, Deputy Rachel Kim said as she approached. I just got off the phone with Internal Affairs. They're sending agents. And a federal van. Mark nodded without looking away. They'll want the files from Burke's office. His private safe. Make sure they check it. Rachel hesitated. Mark, what is all this? They're saying you found a burial site? Bones? Mark turned to her, his voice low. It's bigger than us, Rachel. Bigger than this town. That old Reynolds farm? It was a black site. A forgotten experiment in psychological warfare. They used dogs, canines genetically and psychologically altered for combat. Shadow was one of them. Rachel blinked. But he's a dog. Mark knelt next to Shadow, gently stroking his fur. He was. And he's more than that. He always was. She looked at the dog warily, then back to Mark. And Burke. He was part of the cover-up. He killed Jared when he got too close to the truth. Probably others too. That pit was full. Rachel shook her head, trying to process it all. This doesn't feel real. It's real, Mark said quietly. An hour later, the agents arrived, black suits. Earpieces. Not FBI, not DHS, something else. They said very little, only showed black credentials embossed with a gold insignia Mark didn't recognize. They didn't ask for his report. Instead, they collected Burke, collected the files, and sealed off the clearing in the woods. By sunrise, the site was surrounded with black vehicles and camo-clad soldiers moving like shadows among the trees. The pit? Filled in. Sanitized. The barn? Demolished. And the story? Jared Cole's body was recovered thanks to an anonymous tip. The press release would read, Sheriff Burke arrested for obstruction and misconduct. No mention of the bones. No mention of Shadow. It was a whitewash. But Mark had expected that. And he had prepared. He'd copied the files. Hidden the photo. And most importantly, he hid Shadow. Later that evening, Mark sat on the steps of his small house on the outskirts of town. Shadow lay beside him, watching the woods, ears twitching at every sound. You found your way back to me, Mark said, his voice rough. Shadow lifted his head and gave a soft woof. Why now? Mark asked. Why after all this time? The dog looked into the distance as if answering something beyond the trees. Something unseen. Mark followed his gaze. The wind stirred again. The woods whispered, and for a split second, Mark swore he saw movement, another figure, another shape, standing tall and watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. Shadow didn't move. Just stayed beside him, loyal as ever. Mark took a long breath. We're not done, are we? Shadow didn't reply, but Mark already knew the answer. The following nights were quieter, at least on the surface. With Burke in federal custody and the woods sealed off, Ash Hollow fell back into its usual rhythm. On paper, everything was returning to normal, but Mark knew better. He wasn't sleeping. Not deeply, anyway. His dreams were laced with strange whispers, flickering images of that clearing, of bones shifting in the dirt, and of Shadow standing sentinel at the edge of something dark. He'd taken to keeping his cruiser parked near the tree line of Reynolds' farm, despite the government signs and the chain-link fences. Something told him they hadn't finished burying everything. Shadow was always with him, silent, alert, never straying far, and then the howling started. It began on the third night after Burke's arrest. A deep, mournful sound that echoed across the woods, too loud to be a regular dog, too wrong to be natural. Mark stood in his kitchen when he heard it, low and guttural like a wounded thing calling out to something older than the forest itself. Shadow bolted upright and pressed his head against the screen door, growling softly. "You know what it is, don't you?" Mark whispered. Shadow looked back at him, and for a terrifying moment Mark saw something utterly human in his eyes. Not intelligence, not comprehension. Something else. Memory. That night, Mark took the cruiser and drove out toward the edge of the woods. He left the car idling and stepped into the underbrush, flashlight sweeping the ground as he followed the sound of the howling. Shadow moved ahead like a phantom, his footsteps silent despite the crunch of fallen leaves beneath Mark's boots. They reached the clearing again. But it was different now. Gone was the pit, the barn, the relics of horror. In their place was a strange stillness, the kind that makes you forget how to breathe. Then Mark saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, shimmering just beyond the tree line, glowing faintly with reflected light. Silent. Watching. Shadow stopped at Mark's side, tail stiff, ears high. He let out a sharp bark, a warning. The eyes blinked out. One by one. Then the woods went quiet again. "What are they?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Shadow didn't answer. Instead, he padded toward the center of the clearing, and Saturday Mark followed, kneeling beside him. That's when he noticed the ground. A circular pattern of scorched earth, as if something had burned into the soil long ago, concentric rings with strange symbols in between. It wasn't military. It wasn't human. Mark stared at it, his mind trying to rationalize what he saw. "Shadow," he whispered. "Is this where you were made?" The dog didn't move. Just kept his eyes on the trees, on the things that might still be watching. That's when Mark heard the voice, not out loud, but in his head. A single word, awaken. He stumbled back, grabbing his ears, heart racing. Shadow stepped between him and the trees, growling low. Something had been triggered. Something was coming. Mark paced inside his dimly lit living room, blinds drawn, his service weapon loaded and within arm's reach on the kitchen table. His laptop sat open, screen glowing with the decrypted documents he had secretly copied from Burke's safe. It wasn't just blackmail material, it was a roadmap. Shadow lay beside the door, motionless except for the occasional twitch of his ears. He hadn't barked or whined since they left the clearing. But Mark could sense his tension coiled beneath the surface like a spring ready to snap. The documents revealed everything. Project Sentinel. MK-K9.IT started in the early 80s as a collaboration between DARPA and a private biotech firm called Cryon Dynamics. The goal was to engineer super-intelligent dogs capable of emotion mirroring, essentially dogs that could sync with their handlers on a neurochemical level, but the experiments had gone too far. Some dogs developed traits they couldn't explain: sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, the ability to predict threats before they occurred. One file even mentioned dreams shared between dogs and handlers. Shadow's name appeared repeatedly in the final logs. He was designated Unit 12K with a note in red ink: extreme loyalty. Psychic bleed suspected. Do not terminate. Observe in field. But the project was shut down, or so they claimed. Mark scrolled further, heart pounding. The last entry was dated October 12, 2009. That was the day Jared disappeared. Subject 12K and handler J. Cole entered Reynolds Field testing site. Unauthorized. Encountered residual echo anomaly. Cole terminated during breach event. Subject escaped containment. Status unknown. Mark leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. He looked at Shadow. "You were there," he said softly. "That night? With Jared. You saw it happen." Shadow's eyes met his. No denial. Just silent confirmation. "What's an echo anomaly?" Mark whispered. Suddenly, a low hum filled the room. Not mechanical, vibrational. Like sound coming from beneath the floorboards. Shadow stood up, ears high. Then the power cut out. Mark grabbed his flashlight and weapon, heart pounding, and moved toward the window. Outside, a low fog had crept in. Not natural fog, thicker, almost oily in texture. It rolled across the road, swallowing street lamps as it moved. Then a shadow passed through it, 0.7 feet tall. Human in shape. But wrong. Its limbs moved with too many joints. Its head tilted in jagged snaps. It didn't walk, it glided. Mark backed away from the window. "What the hell is that?" Shadow growled, deep and guttural. The front door creaked, slowly, as if being tested. Mark raised his weapon, flashlight fixed on the door. Tap. A single clawed finger scraped the wood. Tap. Tap. Mark fired through the door, once, twice. The recoil thundered in the silence. The tapping stopped. When he flung the door open, there was nothing there. Only fog. He stepped outside cautiously. The fog began to part as if afraid of him. Or of Shadow, who now stood at the top of the porch steps, his body glowing faintly with a bluish pulse beneath his fur. "What are you?" Mark asked again. The hum in the air grew louder. Shadow looked back and gave one low bark. Then the fog whispered one word, just barely audible: Sentinel. Mark stood paralyzed on the porch, his eyes fixed on the rolling fog that writhed across the road like a living thing. He could still hear the faint hum resonating in the air, low, steady, unnatural. The air smelled like metal and ozone, and Shadow, his dog, his partner, now emitted a dim glow beneath his fur, like bioluminescence in the dark. Sentinel, Mark repeated the word. It wasn't just a code name. It was a role, and Shadow had just claimed it. Mark knelt down, hand trembling as he reached for the dog's paw. The same paw he had seen that first night, scarred, not from combat, but from something, seared. The pads had a faint circular mark burned into them. Not a brand. A symbol, the same symbol that was scorched into the ground at the Reynolds clearing. Suddenly, Shadow jerked his head toward the road, ears perked, body rigid. The fog was shifting again, splitting, and then it stepped through. Not one of the spindly shadows from before, this was taller, broader, more solid, and terrifying. Its face was smooth. No mouth. No nose. Just two eyes, white and glowing. Its form shimmered like it couldn't quite stay tethered to this reality. Mark raised his weapon instinctively, but deep down he knew, bullets wouldn't do a damn thing to whatever this was. The creature stared at Shadow. Then it spoke, not with a mouth, but directly into Mark's mind. "You awakened the signal. The connection is incomplete. Return the source." Mark staggered. "Return what source? What do you want?" The creature's head tilted at an impossible angle. It pointed at Shadow. "He is breachborn. He carries memory. He is the door." "Like hell," Mark growled, stepping between them. "You're not taking him." Shadow growled again, more ferociously than Mark had ever heard. The glow around his body intensified. The symbols on his paw flared, echoing with the same light that flickered across the entity's form. Then it moved. Fast point. One moment it was 10 feet away, the next, it was inches from Mark, hand reaching for Shadow. Shadow leapt. The collision cracked the air with a thunderous pop, like lightning in reverse. The shockwave knocked Mark backward off the porch. He landed hard, dazed, as Shadow and the creature wrestled in the fog, limbs blurring, energy crackling like static around them. Mark tried to rise, but something held him down. Gravity felt twisted, and then a sound split the night. A howl, not from Shadow. From the woods, then another, and another. Hundreds. The trees moved, and from the forest came others. Dogs. Dozens of them. Ghost white, glowing faintly, eyes locked on the battle in the fog. Some limped. Some bore old wounds. All of them looked like Shadow. They surrounded the creature. It hesitated. Faltered. Then Shadow released a sharp, high-pitched bark that echoed like a command, and the pack charged. The creature screeched, not in pain, but in fury as the spectral dogs swarmed it. The fog exploded outward in a violent gust, scattering leaves, dirt, and branches. Mark shielded his eyes. When he looked again, the creature was gone. The fog had lifted, and only Shadow remained, panting, glowing, alive. Mark knelt in the dirt, chest heaving, eyes wide as Shadow slowly approached him, glow dimming, singed in a few places but intact. The other dogs, those spectral guardians, had vanished as quickly as they'd arrived. Like the fog, they had come with a mission and left with its fulfillment. Shadow sat in front of Mark, eyes locked on his partner. "You okay, boy?" Mark rasped, still trying to steady his breathing. Shadow tilted his head, then nudged Mark's chest with his nose, soft, like a reassurance. That singular gesture spoke volumes more than words ever could. Mark sat back and looked up at the sky. Stars were reappearing. The air felt clearer, the oppressive hum gone. Whatever that entity had been, whatever breachborn meant, Shadow had fought it. And won. But why him? Why now? Mark rose and staggered back inside, Shadow following close behind. He sat heavily at the table, reopened the files on his laptop, and scanned through them again, desperate for answers. In one of the final pages, a new section caught his eye. Previously encrypted, now unlocked. Phase 3 contingency. In the event of breach failure, Sentinel-class subjects are to be monitored in the field for activation response. Primary handler bonding required. Secondary bonding possible via emotional trauma or psychic resonance. Note: Subject 12K has demonstrated unprecedented loyalty. Considered an anomaly. Termination vetoed by Dr. Holland. Last known location: Ash Hollow, KY. Mark read that line over and over. Psychic resonance. Emotional trauma. That's why Shadow came to him, not by chance, but because he had lost Jared. Because they had shared the grief. Because they were linked by that same night, the same secret, the same silence. He closed the laptop and looked at the dog lying at his feet. I guess we were chosen, he murmured. You and me. Shadow's tail thumped softly. Mark's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Mark Talbot, he said cautiously. A woman's voice replied, calm and clinical. Detective Talbot, this is Dr. Evelyn Holland. We've been monitoring your situation. I believe it's time we met. Mark stiffened. Monitoring? Who the hell are you people? Cryon Dynamics, officially, she replied. But unofficially, we're the reason your dog is still alive. And why your town still exists. Mark felt his anger rising. You experimented on him. On Jared. You covered up murders. We prevented a doorway from being opened, she replied. One that leads to things no human is ready to face. Project Sentinel wasn't about control, it was about containment. There was a pause. I can answer your questions. But only if you come alone. Bring Shadow. We have less time than you think. Before Mark could reply, the call ended. He stared at the phone, jaw clenched. More secrets, he muttered. More lies. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. The creature might have been banished, but the doorway it came through hadn't closed. And maybe Shadow was the only one who could find it again. Mark reached for his keys. We're not done yet, partner. Shadow stood without a sound, ready. They drove for hours under a sky bruised with twilight, the horizon painted in hues of warning. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, never shifting, never blinking. It was as if he knew exactly where they were going. Mark's GPS didn't have the coordinates Dr. Holland had sent, but the truck did. The moment Mark plugged in the route, the screen glitched for a split second, then rerouted him through a stretch of government-owned wilderness just west of the Appalachian Ridge. It was marked on no map. It shouldn't have existed, and yet here they were. They reached a rusted-out gate flanked by concrete towers half-sunk into the hillside. A red light scanned the windshield, and without a word, the gate creaked open. Dr. Evelyn Holland was waiting just inside, dressed in black tactical attire, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Two men with rifles flanked her, but neither looked like they wanted to be there. You brought him, she said, nodding toward Shadow. Mark exited the vehicle, hands still near his holstered gun. He's not a sample. He's my partner. I understand, she replied calmly. But you need to understand he is also a lock. And something is still trying to use him as a key. Mark looked down at Shadow. The dog's eyes were locked on Holland. Not hostile. Just aware. Doctor. Holland gestured toward the bunker behind her. Please. We don't have much time. The breach site is reawakening. The inside of the facility was cold and metallic, like walking through a morgue carved into a mountain. Holland led them deeper underground, past long-sealed labs and observation rooms. Then they reached it. The vault. A steel door, 20 feet high, covered in glyphs and carvings that were neither ancient nor modern. Like they had been etched by something mimicking human hands. There was no handle. No keypad. Only a single handprint scanner at its base. Mark stepped forward. Let me guess, Shadow's supposed to open that. Not alone, Holland said. With you. You're bonded now. You see the world through each other. Mark stared at the scanner. And what's behind it? She hesitated. The original breach. The one that took Jared. His heart stopped. Shadow moved closer, nose brushing the panel. Mark placed his hand next to Shadow's paw. The scanner glowed, then split apart with a mechanical groan. The vault opened. Inside was a chamber unlike anything Mark had seen, pulsing blue light. Floating stones and air that seemed thick with whispers. The walls shimmered like glass, but through them was another place. A forest that stretched into shadow where time moved differently. Where gravity bent sideways. In the center was a small form, frozen, familiar. Jared? Mark gasped. His brother was encased in some kind of suspended field. Eyes closed, body whole but unmoving. He's alive, Holland whispered. Or at least paused. That's what the breach does. It doesn't kill. It holds. Mark stepped forward. But the moment his boot touched the platform, a voice rang out. Sentinel activated. The room pulsed. Shadow stepped beside Jared, placed his paw on the platform. The symbols on the floor lit up, a ring of fire and light surrounded them, and then Jared breathed. His chest rose, his eyes fluttered open. Mark! Tears filled Mark's eyes as he lunged forward, grabbing his brother. You're here. You're okay. I've got you. Jared was weak, but conscious. Shadow stood quietly behind them, watching, his body glowing brighter than ever before. Doctor. Holland stepped forward. You did it. The lock is sealed. The breach is stable. But Shadow didn't move. He walked to the edge of the chamber, sat down, and howled, long and low. From the walls, whispers responded. Is he okay? Mark asked. Holland's expression softened. He's completed his directive. The psychic bond allowed him to bridge the breach. But to keep it closed, Mark's eyes widened. No, he's not staying. Shadow looked back at him, and Mark saw it. Peace. Gratitude. Love. He knelt down, hugging the dog, burying his face in his fur. Thank you, boy. Thank you for saving both of us. Shadow licked his face once, then turned toward the breach and stepped inside. The chamber dimmed. The vault began to seal, and the door was shut. Forever.